West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
Good morning. Or in the case of our friends in Europe, Great Britain, good afternoon. I'm Dan Cooperstock. Welcome to West Hill. Welcome to everyone here in the hall and to everyone on Zoom and who all together make up West Hill United Church. So when I was asked to be the reader today, my one concern was about the land acknowledgement. While I respect our doing them, I do not feel that I've done enough myself about the important issues that they raise to feel entirely comfortable reading them. Instead, I'm sharing with you a short video about land acknowledgements from the wonderful CBC sketch comedy series Baroness von Sketch Show, which uses humor to, I see someone has heard it before, it uses humor to raise important questions. We also shared this video a couple of times at Toronto Oasis when I was in the leadership team there. So go for it. Okay. How can a 3-pound mass of jelly that you can hold in your hand, in your palm, imagine angels, contemplate the meaning of infinity, and even question its own place in the cosmos? Especially awe-inspiring is the fact that any single brain, including yours, is made up of atoms that were forged in the hearts of countless far-flung stars billions of years ago. These particles drifted for eons and light years until gravity and change brought them together here, now. These atoms now form a conglomerate, your brain, that can not only ponder the very stars that gave it birth, but can also think about its own ability to think and wonder about its own ability to wonder. That's from V.S. Ramachandran from The Telltale Brain, a neuroscientist's quest for what makes us human. To put the world in order, we must first cultivate our personal life. We must first set our hearts right. Confucius. And this one should have been for next week too, although I suspect it was a different meaning of the word intended. The universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. And that's from the biologist J.B.S. Haldane from his essay titled Possible Worlds. It is essential to understand our brains in some detail if we are to assess correctly our place in this vast and complicated universe we see all around us. That's Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the double helix, from his book, What Mad Pursuit. Oh, and I forgot to tell you before we start that at the end of these readings, we customarily add the phrase, which I will do now, offered as wisdom for the journey, and we invite you to respond, if you so wish, with, may we walk in its light. So offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in its light. Okay, welcome back now to Mark Reimers. I think many of you know, I've known Mark since high school. We were together in high school and university, and so it's always a delight to hear him. And he's been a regular speaker here, as most of you know, over the past year. I'm going to give his bio and then give a little extra invitation, which I mentioned to him earlier. So Mark Reimers is an associate professor in the neuroscience program at Michigan State, where he integrates statistical analysis with biological theory while analyzing and interpreting very large data sets now being generated in neuroscience, especially from the high-throughput technologies developed by the Brain Initiative, which is something he's obviously working on. And today, Mark's actually going to be talking to us about neuroscience. Mark knows so much about so many things, and several of his talks have had nothing to do with it. But just to start, Mark, an invitation, if you wish, to share with us a bit about your most recent work, and if you wish to share anything about what you like to do when you're not hard at work, just before you start your prepared speech?
Well, Dan, thank you for those kind words. That's you've described the person I would like to be. I hope I'm coming close. Um, and so my most recent professional work, or the thing that I'm most excited about right now, is we're developing a new kind of brain imaging system for small animals that will enable us to track the activity of thousands, tens of thousands of individual neurons distributed across the entire cortex of a small animal. This has never been done before, and we're hoping that it will make a big difference to brain research around the world, because it's not that expensive. That's the big thing. Lots of very smart people have very good ideas, but don't have a lot of money, and that's going to make that's the thing we want to work on. So, what do I like to do in my spare time? What little I have of it. So yes, I like to give talks. I feel that the calling of a scholar is to think and to reflect and to integrate information and science, but also to engage, with everybody. What what does it mean? How is it going to affect us? So I'm privileged to do these kinds of talks, but I also like to kayak. I like to hike. I like to bicycle. I am trying to arrange a trip to do the Alpa Adriata Trail in Europe. Some of you may know that. I'd like to, see the countryside. I like to visit new countries. We'll actually be going to Morocco for the very first time over Christmas, and sleeping in a Berber tent, probably very cold. So in the winter in the Sahara, it's not always warm. Uh, but yeah, that's probably enough. Um, so Dan, do you want to say something more, or shall I start my presentation? So I'll be talking to you about how brain science, the state of brain science now, and how I think it's going to illuminate our quest for the good life. But uh, I'd like to imagine more what it's going to bring. Next slide, please. So this will be in three parts, and I'll just give you a brief introduction to some brain basics, and then I'll talk about some things you probably haven't heard, new discoveries, and then I'll reflect a little on what they might mean. Next slide, please. Okay. So what is neuroscience? What is brain science? Well, most people think of it as study of diseased brains or injured brains. What can go wrong with your brain? And certainly that's a big part of it. That's more neurology. But we certainly talk about those things and study those things. You may think of it as, study of cells, the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of what's in our heads, the tissues, the cell types, that kind of thing. And that's certainly a big part of neuroscience. And that's probably been as much as we've been able to do for most of the last century. But just recently, we've begun to get a hand, or to explore how all of those cells, all of those rather dull, uh, almost mechanical elements that are represented at the picture at the bottom left. You have a sort of a brain open up, and you've got on the left half, you've got a bunch of workers in cubicles, and really dull things, and those are to represent the cells. You don't think of a cell as having much personality or much joie de vivre or a rich experience, and they probably don't. But from all of those cells working together, we get all of the stuff on the right-hand side of the picture, all of the joys, the richness of experience, the fears, the loves and hates, and all of the things that make up a human life. So how do we get there? That's the big mystery that we're beginning to try to explore. And when we do have some knowledge of that, how can we use that to live better? Next slide, please. So I want to just do a few brain basics. So your brain weighs about 3 pounds, or a little over 1 kilogram, if since you're in Canada, um, and fills the space. So this is for my American audience. So it'd be about 1,300 cubic centimeters for you, and the cells that do most of the work of thinking and feeling are called neurons. Uh, and there's in the main part of your brain somewhere between 15 and 20 billion neurons in the main part of your brain. And then tucked in behind the top of your spinal cord, just at the base of your skull, there's another 70 billion neurons, but they're very small. Most of them are very small. We don't usually think about those so much, but they do play a role. And most of them look like the picture that you're seeing at the bottom left. They are, the typical cell size. So there may be 1/100th, a little more than 1/100th of a millimeter across, but they have these branches that go off in all directions, and they look like trees. Next slide, please. Are we getting the animation? No, it looks like not. Can we start it? Oh, well. This was supposed to be an animation, but we'll see. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So you're imagining human brain rotating, and most of us, see the outside, the rind, as it were. Actually, cortex is a word that means rind. So the cortex of a fruit, or the rind of a fruit, or of a nut. But the inside is just as interesting. And there are many regions there that have to do with our sense of self, our feeling about our situation right now, and our hopes and fears for what the next few moments may bring. And those are the areas that are highlighted in color in this rotating picture on the left. On the right is something that I would be happy to have as a psychedelic bicycle helmet to wear down the street. I'm sure it would be eye-catching. But it actually is a representation of sort of the internet of your brain. So, of course, your cells are very small, but they send messages back and forth across your entire brain at very high speed, to many other cells in different regions. And it's this constant conversation, both within regions and across regions, that is what makes your brain work. And this is just a representation on the bottom right of just the upper inch of your brain, the connections, the internet, so to speak, of the top inch of your brain. There's many more superhighways further down, which would make it too complex to show. But so the idea is that there's constant communication on a cell-to-cell level, very specific level. And keep that in mind. It's not that every cell in one region is sending messages to every cell in every other region. It's more like the internet, that specific computers are connected to specific other computers. So specific cells are sending messages to a few other cells in a far-off region. Next slide, please. So what is that actually like? So here on the top right, I'm showing the flashing lights are neurons, individual neurons in a monkey brain. So they're very similar to ours. So this is about less than 1/10 of a millimeter across. So about 1/10 of a millimeter by 1/5 of a millimeter. And you can see hundreds of individual cells sort of flashing off and on at what seem to be random intervals. And that's what's happening in your brain right now. And if you were to take any bit of cortex across your brain, and you were somehow able to visualize that as they have here for the monkey, this is pretty much what you'd see. And so if you translate that into sound rather than into movie, it's listening into this is very much like the shouting of a dinner party. You've been to one of those wedding parties where everybody's talking and nobody's listening, or you don't know that they're listening. Some people are listening, but everybody seems to be talking. And it seems like absolute chaos, and yet they manage to communicate, briefly. Of course, people shift their attention from one speaker to another very rapidly. And that's what's happening in your brain. Sometime, for a second or two, a neuron's maybe listening to several other neurons over here, and then they'll switch their attention and start listening to and responding to neurons over here. And it's a very chaotic process. And it's a miracle that we can feel ourselves as if we are actually one coherent being. But that is one of the big illusions. We are not really that coherent. We are many, many processes happening at once, being constantly reined in. And how that's happening is one of the subjects of research right now. Next slide, please. So how did we get the connections that we have? How are all those very specific wirings set up between, specific thousands of specific cells in the front and millions of specific cells in the back? Well, one of the big evolutionary differences between human beings and other apes is in our brain growth. And in particular, your cortex has many distinct regions with distinct functions. Some of these regions are specialists. So at the back of the head, you've got lots of regions that are specializing in processing what you see with your eyes. They take all the nerve impulses from your optic nerve and process them and digest them and make some sense out of them. And there are other areas for what you hear or for what is touching you. But there are many areas that act to coordinate or link together all of those specialist areas for what you're seeing or hearing or how you're moving. And the remarkable thing about the human brain is that those areas are the ones that grow enormously, expand, balloon out during early childhood. And those areas are the ones that are making specific connections. You can think of them like the on-ramps or off-ramps to the superhighways that connect the different parts of the brain. So where do you exit? What connections do you make? Who specifically talks to who? All of those kinds of decisions are made during early childhood, and they're based on the kinds of experiences you have. And that's one of the reasons why we, in the long run, outperform apes. Our synapses, our connections grow much more slowly. So if you had a 2-month-old child and a 2-month-old monkey, the 2-month-old monkey is much smarter. The 2-month-old monkey knows a lot more about the world than a 2-month-old human infant. But the 2-month-old monkey will peak at about 6 months. They're not going to acquire much more knowledge after that. But the human baby keeps acquiring and modeling itself after parents and other people for years afterward. Next slide, please. And so it really shouldn't be a surprise, although it often is a surprise to us, how differently our brains work under the hood. We keep being surprised when we find out that someone whom we thought we knew has a completely different take on an issue, and we don't understand. How could they believe that? How could they think that? And yet, our brains really are wired very, very differently under the hood. And it's because of the shaping in early childhood. Your experiences were very different than mine and very different from your spouse's experiences. Next slide, please. And I'd like to have you go through these slides fairly quickly when I give the signal, 4 slides in quick succession. So one of the big mysteries is consciousness, and we do not have a full explanation of consciousness right now. But one of the things that's pretty clear is that consciousness depends on the rapid exchange of information between different brain regions, using all of those superhighways that I showed you a few slides ago. And I'm just going to illustrate this with a study that was done about 10 years ago, comparing what happens when you give people a very, very brief picture, show people a picture so briefly that it's a sort of a matter of chance whether they consciously see it or not. It's called subliminal perception. So sometimes your visual cortex responds, but you can't report what you saw. And sometimes for this, for exactly the same stimulus, you say, I recognize that, I saw something. So what's the difference in brain activity? That's the sort of experiment that people can do. And you can then contrast what's your brain activity when you see the subliminal stimulus and you just don't register, versus what's the brain activity when you see it and you say, I recognize that, I saw that. So if you could play the next 3 slides in rapid succession. Thank you. So what's happening is that in about half a second, when you're subliminally seeing something but not recognizing it, the activity is confined to the visual cortex. When you're seeing something and then you become aware of it, the picture is what unfolds it on the right, where you have activity in the visual cortex, but then you have activity in the frontal cortex engaging about a quarter of a second in after you've started seeing things, and then it feeds back and sustains the activity in the visual cortex. Whereas if you're not conscious, that activity just dissipates and you move on to whatever you're seeing next. So it requires this rapid communication. All of this is happening on a split-second time scale between the front and the back of the brain. We can talk about that later. Next slide, please. So how can brain science sort of help us live better or enlighten our lives? Again, at the moment, we have mostly promissory notes and hints. We don't have anything very definite, but I think we have some hints from science already. Next slide, please. So first is something that those of us who are distressed at the state of the world, at conflict and war, as was discussed earlier, may find surprising, but actually we humans are among the most cooperative of apes. So if you were to, plop yourself down in a chimpanzee troop, you would find constant aggression and competition. And most apes are like that. They're always competing. Some of you may know that the murder rate among chimpanzees, among adult male chimpanzees, is about 40%. That's a murder rate that we would not tolerate. We would not want to live in such a society. But our ancestors had a kind of unusual experience in that unlike the chimpanzees or most other apes, they spent a long time out on the savannah where there were big food packages that no one person could eat all of, but that needed a lot of eyes and a lot of hands to find and to process. So they were selected for more cooperation than has happened in other apes. And that means that we have the potential for a kind of happiness that most other apes can't, it's difficult for them to imagine, to achieve. So why are we not particularly happy now? Well, our ecology has changed. So it's no longer necessary for us to cooperate very much, perhaps beyond our family. Modern environments really give scope to the older ape mind that is both aggressive and Machiavellian. And this gives us some possibility if we can change our environments to reward cooperation, reward working together, and rather than achieving dominance, then we would be bringing out those aspects of our nature. Next slide, please. So another distinctive aspect of the human psyche that is relevant to about a good life and a good society is conscience. We feel, we feel moved by other people's pain. Especially if we've caused it, um, and we want to avoid causing it. So many, and that's of course the feeling of guilt. Um, right now it's fashionable to sort of dismiss guilt or to say that guilt is an evil thing, but in fact it's important for maintaining good relationships. You can certainly have too much guilt, like you can have too much of anything, but you really don't want to be with someone who doesn't suffer any guilt at all. Um, and as we in the United States seem to be finding, um, the and the when we put people in the scanner and induce senses of guilt, the areas of the brain that seem to be active are those areas not that involve rule following or um, religion, but areas that involve um, social relations, especially close social relationships. And you can tell that guilt is really effective when people are motivated to try to repair a relationship. Um, so when you're feeling, complaining about feeling guilty, keep in mind that that's also what makes it possible for you to sustain long-term relationships. Uh, and studies show that people, who feel a moderate amount of guilt usually have happier lives in the long run because they maintain their relationships. Next slide, please. Um, so, uh, it's often a truism of popular psychology that you should live in the present. And this is, all of the pictures about that show people wonderful and peaceful nature. It's sure it's easy to live in the present when you're, you know, by a riverbank, listening to the sound of the water and with the wind ruffling your hair. Sure, who wouldn't want to live in the present? We can shed our concerns. But most of us live most of the time in noisy, politicized environments, competitive environments. We don't want to live in the present there. And evolution hasn't necessarily uh, selected for us to live in the present in those environments. We're only there because we're trying to achieve something. So in that case, the neuroscience evidence is that we can learn to be much more at peace with the shifting emotions of our work environments, but only through considerable meditation or other self-discipline, other practices that are needed to sort of hold, recognize one's emotions and not get sucked into them. But that's not something that evolution has really prepared us for. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, I'm working on methods to record from small animals, but there are other people who are working on methods to record from people's brains. We will not have anything like the fine detail from human recordings that we have from small animals, but we will be able to, it looks like very soon, be able to track, and we can even now, with some technologies, track the sort of shifting, conflicting agendas and conflicting processes going on in people's brains. You have to use very sensitive and very expensive magnets to see this now, but it is possible to see social conflicts playing out in people's brains. Interestingly enough, a lot of the study of social conformity has been done in Russia and China. For some reason, neuroscientists there are much more aware of these issues than in the United States. But one surprising thing is that if you and let's say 99 of your friends are all coming to a scanner and you just daydream about the things you like to think about, then scientists can identify your particular scan anytime they see it again. So you have such an individual, unique brain activity fingerprint that it can be identified again and again amongst hundreds of others, not amongst millions of others at this point, but amongst hundreds of others. And of course, that raises concerns about privacy and other things, which we can talk about if you want. And I think that's just about it. But I'd like to say that we are entering an age of neuroscience where we will be able to sort of look beneath the hood in many ways. And I think that we only have some hints right now of what neuroscience can teach us about leading the good life. But I think over the next 50 years, we will have much, much more. So next slide, please. So I'm happy to discuss further, hear your questions. I'd like to know what you would hope for from neuroscience in the future and what I should be thinking about as a scientist. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Hi, Mark. This is Scott.
Sure. Hi, Scott.
Hi. First of all, I have a feeling that we have heard such a toned down technological description from what you could have given us if we were, say, in your classroom or whatever. So I appreciate the fact that I just about understood everything you said, Mark. So thank you for that.
I'm glad to hear that.
My second thought is the backdrop behind you a picture of your own brain scan? Are we seeing you on that?
No. This is art, of course. It's actually from a Toronto company called BioRender. So these are drawings in the manner of the pioneer of neuroscience art, Ramon y Cajal, who was a Spanish wannabe artist. He's sort of like Charles Darwin, very bad boy, and didn't cooperate. And he finally, his father browbeat him to go into medical school, but he ended up spending most of his time drawing pictures under the microscope. And so he set the tone for, he won the Nobel Prize in 1904 for some of his discoveries.
Thank you. Lovely. My next thought was, I appreciated very much the first time you said it. I think your phrase was human beings and other apes. I thought that was quite lovely. And then we went on to explore the family together, which was lovely. And it's really good to remember that, I think. The next thought I had was a tough one, a hard one that you mentioned about, and we've read this in other sources about brains that think very differently than ours, like somebody else that thinks very differently than we do. And I think the struggle is always, how can they think like that? How can they and really what we're saying is, I'm right, and they are wrong because they differ. And they could be to some degree, and we could be to some degree. But I find it challenging and somewhat depressing in that sense of someone else is acting the way they're wired. There's a hopelessness in it for coming together, but a challenge to come together given that. And that's such a tough one when you really, really disagree with someone. And I think particularly if you're disagreeing because you actually think someone's being harmed, if you take that view, that there's a part where it's hard to think it's okay that the person thinks that. So I was wondering if there's some sort of electronic piece of equipment you could zap someone's brain structure and get them to come over to the right way of thinking. If you've invented that, Mark, we'll support it. But that just I've got one other thing, but if you could say just a bit more about that wiredness of us all.
Sure. So remember, it's not that you necessarily have the same beliefs or ideas as your parents or your influence, your early childhood influences, but many of your mental mannerisms, your habits are very, very similar. So, most of us have very different ideas than our parents, maybe politically or religiously. But the way we approach those ideas, the things we pay attention to, what phrases we find significant and telling and compelling, rather than what phrases we blow off and think they're not important. Those are things that we learn from our early childhood. And you may find that many prominent atheists who have overtly rejected the religion of their parents or childhood, nevertheless speak in the manners of their fundamentalist preachers. And that many of the times we may disagree with our parents, but if we have an argument with them, we'll often argue along the same terms. And partly that's why these arguments can be so fierce compared to, say, arguments between strangers, because we feel the same the same compulsion of certain kinds of ideas or phrases, or certain kinds of emotions, whereas other people seem indifferent or impervious to something we think is very telling. And that's, reflecting our different wiring. Sir, it means that you have to really work at communication about hard things. It's not coming naturally to us. Descartes and Plato, I think, misled us in the West into thinking that reason was an inherent property of the mind. It's not. It requires work. And you may remember, I think the last time I spoke on Native American societies, and that the Haudenosaunee went to great lengths to have a proper debate. They didn't just put people who disagreed in an arena and let them slug it out. They had very, very elaborate, almost ritualized rules for that, because that's the way that they could bring out the best in people. We don't do that in the West. We have too much pride in our own intellectual endowment, which I think is a mistake. Many other peoples around the world have recognized our limitations much more fundamentally.
It helps.